Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Now, today I'm honoured to be speaking with sports psychologist Dr Scott Goldman. Scott, welcome to the Sports Psych Show.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Well, I'm super excited to be speaking. Why don't we get started by you introducing yourself to the Sports Psych Show audience?
Okay. Hi, my name is Scott Goldman, and I am a licensed clinical psychologist as well as performing advanced performance techniques, optimal performance techniques for elite athletes, and have been doing this for about the last 20 to 25 years.
20 to 25 years, so some serious industry experience there. And I know you've worked with a range of teams and individuals. What does this sort of a day-to-day role look like at the moment for you? What have you been up to recently?
Yeah, so my current job title is I'm the Director of High Performance Psychology for one of the 32 NFL teams here in the United States. What does a day-to-day job look like as the Director of Performance Psychology? It's interesting. I kind of think about the work as being a spectrum of care, from emotional distress, like suicidal thoughts or maybe abuse issues, to optimal performance, like, hey, what would be a good pre-performance routine before our game on Sunday? I've also found on that spectrum of care that it's not linear as much as it's maybe bent, almost like a donut, because I think how people perform, especially at the professional level, can have an impact on other aspects of their life. They've had a bad day at the office, so to speak, and they go home and their fuse might be a little bit shorter with their wife or their partner, that kind of stuff. So I don't think of sports psychology as being binary, generally speaking. So just the direct patient care, the direct athlete care really is about that full spectrum. But then there's also this vertical role that I play, which is, I do serve the head coach, the GM, the vice president, as well as the coaching staffs and front office staffs and employees. So that has a lot more to do with system dynamics, organizational structure, team dynamics. So, for example, right now the phase that we're in has a lot to do with pre-draft selection and evaluating our current roster. And so I take a heavy role providing that resource for our coaches.
It's certainly wide-ranging, and I think it's really interesting, Scott, because I don't know about you. I think over the years what I've found is organisations haven't necessarily been able to define neatly what a sports psychologist does or what a sports psychologist can offer. And maybe that's our bad as sports psychologists. And something I've always said to coaches and organisations over the years is almost like a three-tiered approach. At the very top of that tier, you've got the performance psychology piece. Then maybe in the middle, you've got the welfare and the well-being, and then maybe at the bottom you've got the mental health piece. So maybe that's a bit more of a linear model that you mentioned, but just taking you up on that notion of spectrum of care, and what I've found historically, and you alluded to this, is that performance psychology piece can drip feed into the welfare and well-being, which ultimately can not all the time, can drip feed into the mental health aspect of it. They're all kind of they're separate but interlinked as well. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think interlinked, blend for sure. I mean, I like, and I think you and I have an alignment here, which is I agree with you. I think we've done a bad job of defining the field. And I think because of how, we have marketed ourselves and the service that we provide, I think sometimes we can even be hyperbolic in our description or our impact. And so I think what's really interesting right now in the United States, while we've all been kind of debating what the work is and what the definition of it is, the leagues have gone ahead and started to establish and define it. Right now we're seeing a huge movement in the NFL, the National Football League, as well as the NBA, the National Basketball Association, as well as Major League Baseball, where they are saying this is we're going to define it for you. And the impression that I'm getting from that definition is the foundation or the baseline where you will be keeping your home is ensuring and safety, welfare, and mitigating risk. And then you grow beyond that. So it's really like the mental health resource is what every league wants every team to have well established and solidified. And then the roles can blossom beyond that. So going back to it, like when I'm actually talking to a GM or a head coach, it depends also who or what they've been exposed to previously, because I do think we have an industry that does have some carnival barkers in our world. Oftentimes what I'll do is I kind of will dial down and say, a psychologist, someone who studies human behavior and human interaction. And I think you can take any system, whether it's sport, industrial organization, military, any place that has more than one human being, and you're going to be observing and interacting with human behavior and human interaction. And so that's kind of where I break it down at its simplest, bare bones kind of concept. The other thing that I think is kind of neat is you're watching certain companies like Google, for example, who are talking about the value of being a philosopher or having philosophers in the building. So people who help push dynamic thought and innovative ways of doing things. And so I think sometimes what we do when we're an embedded system, which is what I am with the NFL team that I work for, is we're really there to help be curators of knowledge and professional observers, and then to offer almost philosophic direction that can be something that just clicks for that coach or that player, where they go, oh man, that's great, and then they run with the idea and then do something really neat with it.
There's two things I want to expand on there that I found really, really interesting to me. The first word that you mentioned that really struck a chord was interaction. The interaction between human beings. It's the in-between that counts. And when you said that, why it struck a chord with me is this notion of integration versus isolation. That historically, maybe organizations, but certainly the perception of psychology is you go and do that over there, whether that's through it's something somebody deals with because they've got a problem. But what for me now, and I'm talking about British sports psychology, but it seems to be emerging in the States, and it's very much emerging here, is the importance of integration. Because if we isolate this, then we don't study and monitor and assess and develop those interactions.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And it's interesting because, and this goes to the kind of the binary debate or the territorial battles that we as the field are fighting amongst ourselves, because the people who are more like exercise science trained and are focused on the optimization, one of their criticisms, which is fair, of those that are licensed and doing more of the clinical counseling work, is that notion of confidentiality, that this information is removed, sequestered, isolated, and so what I've always taken on is something kind of like what I would hope Arnold Lazarus would appreciate, or a few others that kind of talk about the notion of being embedded in one's community is really a sign of good health, not just us as practitioners, but the community as well. So I tend to try to merge the two worlds by, yes, honoring confidentiality and honoring my license, especially when it's in those kind of clinical domains, but also taking on a perspective of collaboration and interaction, not just amongst the coach and the player, or the player and the player, or the coach and the coach, but also myself, because I am embedded in this sort of 360-degree work environment.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and the second thing I was going to pinpoint was that dynamic thought, but I'm going to park that. I'm going to come back to it because you opened a doorway there, that confidentiality piece. Because when you first described the role that you've got at the moment, it sounds like a hell of a dance that you've got to play in many respects. You've got the head coach, you've got the GM, you've got the vice president, you've got all of the players, all of the coaching staff. And I know in the NFL these are big organisations with a volume of key stakeholders, volume of enormous wealth of staff. And so that must be an enormous challenge for you in terms of that confidentiality, in terms of just, I suppose, playing that dance between personnel.
Yeah, so I have a slightly different perspective than I think some of my peers. So I hope I'm not talking out of turn, but this is sort of the philosophy that feels right for me. So I'm not going to say this is the right way to do it. It's just the way that is comfortable for me and I feel most ethical about. I think a lot of people confuse confidentiality with secrecy, when I think the real concept of confidentiality is about trust. Like, what we want to do as a license provider is we want to say to the person that we're sitting with, who's about to tell us some very vulnerable personal stuff, that, hey, you can trust me. And I don't know about you, but anyone that says, hey, you can trust me, especially in the first 5 minutes of meeting them, I'm checking my back pocket to see if my wallet's still there. Okay. And so I think part of the notion of confidentiality is to say, look, until we establish this level of trust, until you know where I stand, know that my license is something that's in jeopardy. And that's what protects or ensures the quality or the fidelity of our conversation. And so I found explaining that to folks where I'll say, like, I don't mind losing my job, because I can go across the street and still be a licensed psychologist and do good work somewhere else. But I will not jeopardize losing my license, because if I'm not, without the license, I'm relegated to doing something else that's completely out of the industry that I really love and care about. So if we switch gears and say, okay, confidentiality is really about trust, then the dance becomes a lot less tricky. Because what I'm fortunate enough is when I dialogue with our general manager and our head coach, I have their trust that they know the conversations that I'm going to have are ones that have an alignment with our overall vision, which is, if the person's right, the player will be right. Like, you can't get high production, high value from a player without having that person right first. So the coaches and the GMs I've always worked for, before I sign my contract, I explain all of this, and the really good ones and the ones that I'm so honored to be working with say, yeah, we trust you. Like, we trust that you will know what information to maintain and hold sacred. And then I'll have the same conversation with the players as well, where I say, look, this is really about trust. And what's interesting is, when there comes a time where the conversation warrants including, say, a coach as an adjunctive element to the process, everybody's just on board.
I want to go back to that idea of dynamic thought and organisations potentially employing somebody like a sports psychologist to increase the volume of that dynamic thought. I love that idea, and it's in tune with some of the stuff I've been thinking about recently. Psychologist as sense maker, psychologist as almost not a head of methodology, but a head of social, the psychological and social side component, psychosocial methodology, if you like. Somebody who's there sitting with and alongside the coaching staff to ask questions, to provide underpinning theory, to put more meat on the bone, if you like, with some of the what might be described as fluffier psychosocial side of things. Just want to get your thoughts on that, or your expanse on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a part of me that thinks that that's really where the great work is done. So, I was fortunate to receive a really great training. And in addition to a PhD in clinical psychology, I also earned a PhD in school psychology. And when you think about school psychology, you're really thinking about teaching environments. And so, it's interesting because a lot of times when a child might be disruptive, people will often think about the child as the issue. But what through training, what most people quickly come to appreciate is it's really about the environment. No one's the villain of their own story. So no child or no player wants to be a jerk. And so you're always kind of going, okay, what's going on in this environment that's causing the hiccup and the disruption? And sometimes it can be something like a learning disability. Or with a player, it could be somebody who's struggling to absorb the playbook. And so you go, okay, there's an internal struggle there with an external kind of behavioral reaction. That frustration of I can't digest the playbook is now causing me to act out, and maybe I act bold and brash. But then there's also this other lens, which is I spend a lot of time with our coaches talking about how do we create optimal learning environments? How do we get the best out of people? In sports, it's interesting, right? Because some coaches are love them up types, and other coaches are, break them down and build them back up types. And I've often observed that multiple ways of coaching are successful, and really kind of figuring out what's a fit, between do we get the right players that cater to the coach best, or do we get the right coaches that cater to the player best? It kind of makes me go back to marriage counseling in a way, which a lot of people kind of forget. Like when you're doing couples counseling, there is the husband and what's going on with him. There's the wife and what's going on with her. And then there's a third entity, which is the marriage and what's going on in the relationship. And when you think about that as a three-entity dynamic, I think that becomes a lot more sophisticated. And I find that to be the same in sports, right? There's what's going on with the coach, what's going on with the player, what's going on with the team, and what's going on with the relationship between all of those things, and how really fragile all of these pieces are. Because, if a coach got into a fight with, say, his wife, comes in and is a little bit rougher with his players because there's something still lingering from that, or if they're sleep deprived because they've been working their tails off all week to get the game plan and installs ready, and then some player who comes in who got in a fight with his girlfriend or got into an argument is coming in with his own dynamic, and now all of a sudden there's this explosive element that neither of them are really truly aware of. And then when this relationship happens, everybody's kind of going, whoa, we didn't see that happening. Now what do we do?
It's fascinating, Scott, as you're speaking there. I'm thinking about personal or player responsibility versus coach responsibility, and that dynamic. And I'm thinking historically in coaching, possibly, and this is a general broad brush statement, but possibly coaches have been very quick to attribute personal responsibility or player responsibility as the most important thing, and using that classic word control. You can control your attitude, you can control your effort, perhaps forgetting certain underpinning personality dynamics and the influence that the coach and the environment has on that player. I think it's incumbent, I personally think, and I'd like to get your viewpoint here, I think it's incumbent on a coach to try to help a player have, yes, an internal locus of control. I can take charge of myself, I'm responsible here, but also having an interplay with actually coach locus of control. As a coach, it's my responsibility to help a player take charge of their attitude. I can create an environment and a coaching process and practice that helps them to do that. And I think sometimes that can be externalized towards the player.
Yeah, I think you're really onto something. I mean, this is where I think things are way more sophisticated than we give it credit for. And when it's happening in live time and you're trying to digest all of this as it's unfolding, I think this is a really challenging aspect. And I think it's having that kind of insight that I think really separates good from great when it comes to sports psychologists. Like, just hearing you talk and going, wow, man, I bet Dan's a really I bet you're a really good sports psychologist. I mean, I think you're dialed in, and your radar in that moment is got to be just pinging. I think there's another element just to add to this rich topic and subject matter, which is, don't forget, we're also on a shot clock, right? Like, in the NFL, for example, everything's a sprint to Sunday, which is the day that we play our games. And so sometimes there can be a relationship dynamic where something happens and there's really no time to process. It's like, no, we just got to wipe the slate clean. And so it's interesting because there can be an injury, like an emotional or psychological injury, that doesn't even really have a chance to heal, much less scar. And it's like, nope, we just got to move on to the next week. And there's also an inherent mindset that happens in sports, which is, if Tommy's not available, so let's say it's the heat of a game and the coach looks and says, all right, Tommy, get in there. And he looks down on the bench and Tommy's not there because maybe he's getting his ankle taped or something. Well, it's like, all right, Tommy's not available. All right, Dave, you get in there. And that next man up also, I think, has an implicit sort of bias that says, rather than try to process what's going on with the relationship, let's just replace parts until the parts fit. And so I think one element at the professional level that I find kind of fascinating is how quickly we might cycle out pieces, hoping that we end up with a perfect fit or a catalyst fit, which is we add something new to the system that just gets the system going, rather than saying, wait a minute, let's kind of take a moment here and reflect on why this is happening or not happening. Just as a specific example, and I'll just create a hypothetical, I think there are times where a front office for like an NBA team or an NFL team will say, I know this player is not performing well for us. I know there might be a relationship dynamic to be concerned about, but what if they go somewhere else and they're really good? And I think sometimes it's this idea of just because they're good somewhere else doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be good for us. And there's some things to digest about that.
I love your terms, break them down, love them up. And when you said that, I thought of, I talk about coaches having two dials, a stretch dial and a support dial. I suppose the stretch dial could, in essence, be that break them down. The support dial could be the love them up. Stretch versus support, break down versus love them up. What's great coaching to you with reference to that? You've been involved with so many sporting organisations in the major sports in America. When you stand back and you view great coaching, because so many of the listenership of the Sports Psych show are coaches, from a sports psych perspective, what does great coaching look like?
This is where I'll do my best to answer your question, but I find this to me is the kind of question that often gets us in trouble as a field.
Okay.
Because, and here's why I say that.
Yeah.
If I knew that, I would write the greatest book ever and just be done with it, right? Like, and it would also be like, if I knew that, I would also go to teams and charge a really high price point value and say, you know what, this is the prototype coach, or I can make anyone into this prototype coach. And I do think that we have individuals in our field that do sell either themselves or a product like a book in that way. The super secret, 7 successful, like, I don't know, there's always some kind of alliteration or number order of what makes a great coach.
Yeah.
And I go back to the idea that human behavior is really complex, and human interaction is even more complex. And I think that there's 1,000 ways to get to Rome. You can walk, you can fly, you can drive, you can take a boat. If the goal is to get to Rome, it's about finding your own true path. And I think that you can make an argument like flying's the fastest, but walking, you can take the most of the scenery on your journey there. Like, the quest to get to Rome, I think, is fairly flexible. So what makes great coaching, to bring it back and to try to answer your question, is I think it's when a coach is really true to themselves and true to their own path. That also includes some level of growth and understanding. So they've got their own foundation. They've got their own belief system of, this is what I know. This is what I believe to be true. So if I am a break them down, build them up coach, I think you be true to that. Don't try to be a love them up coach, because it might come across as being disingenuous because it's not natural to you. And make sure that you have the kind of people around you that can support that philosophy, and also have the right kind of players who respond well to that. Similarly, like with the love them up kind of stuff, make sure that you have players that won't take advantage of that. Make sure you have maybe a junkyard dog on your staff that can hold people accountable. So while you're avoiding conflict, someone else is managing it, and that kind of element. So I think what makes a great coach is someone who knows themselves, has a true passion for what they're doing, which is really about teaching, not winning, and just is a constant learner as well as teacher. And that's where I think I go back to the best coaches I've been around have always embraced or enjoyed my role in their system, because we can kind of go philosophical rather than just be like, you know what, here's the recipe, do this, do that. Like, I've said this to a few coaches that I've worked with, where I go, don't look for an answer man who, when you go, how do we do this? And they say, oh, well, here's what you got to do. You got to just break them down and build them up. Or I go, don't look for an answer man. Look for a question guy. And they'll go, well, what's a question guy? I go, a question guy is someone who says, okay, what's the problem? And then the coach gets to explain that. What things have you tried so far? And the coach explains that. And what kinds of things do you wish you could do? And now all of a sudden you're creating an environment where the coach can kind of explore.
Well, that was some awesome stuff, Scott, and I'm going to do something that will frustrate the life out of you here. I'm going to reflect back to you the 6 things I heard. So you've got 6 things in your book that I know you don't like, because it sounds to me you like a little bit more chaos and variability than this. But what I heard was, number 1, meta skills. Know myself, or know yourself. Number 2, once you know yourself, be authentic to that. Number 3, have the right support team that can help you build on your authentic self. Number 4, recruit players to suit. Number 5, be process oriented. And number 6, be philosophically oriented.
Well, that's a very brilliant capture on your part. And maybe we should write the book. There we go. The 6 successful, I don't know,
But you know what's going to happen? You know what's going to happen, Scott, is we'll have a publisher saying, no, these things have to be in 7.
It would be like, and have a pet dog or something. I don't know. We can make the 7th one something. But no, I think you did a really incredible job of summarizing what it was that I was just saying. And it's interesting, because one of the things that stood out to me, even as you were reflecting it, was the idea about your support. General Stanley McChrystal, who I think is just a brilliant mind and has written some fantastic books, Team of Teams, and there's one on leadership, myths and truths. One of the walkways that I got from some of his writing was, he talks about, in the debate of are leaders made or are leaders born, he said it's really neither. It has a lot more to do with their followers. That really great leaders are great because they have followers that follow and execute their vision. And so I think it's interesting, while we're talking about coaches and coaching behavior, it's really about your support cast that I think would be one of the more critical decisions that you're going to have to make as a head coach.
I think that is such a salient point, and a point that is so often missed. And in my experience working in organisations, especially in, say, somewhere like the Premier League, the English Premier League soccer, we refer to the head coach over here as the manager, and it's the manager's coaching staff, the three people. It usually comes in threes, the three people they have around them. For me, in my experience, it's so important that they have complementary skills, a different skill set and similar skill set, and you give those staff, and I think to add, and I'd like to get your view on this, they support the manager or the head coach, but they also have the psychological safety to express their views, to push back, to air what they feel works, but also what they feel isn't the right course of action.
Yeah. So first, I'd love to thank you for catering to the isolated American by calling it soccer versus football and clarifying coach versus manager. I recognize that we all would benefit from recognizing the global community. So I appreciate you translating, but we can call it football. Now, going back to it, I think you make a really valuable point about support, which is support isn't always about agreement. Support is about saying, look, let's come to a collective decision. And once we do come to a collective decision, then we execute fully and commit to that fully. Because there should be a moment. So again, going back to some great literature, Atul Gawande's Checklist Manifesto, which I think is one of the all-time great books out there. And in that book where he talks about the value of a checklist, he also talks about a stop point or a checkpoint where anyone in the system and everyone in the system takes a moment to reevaluate the process as they're going through the checklist. And so I think the example that he used in his book that resonated to me was even during a surgical procedure, not just the surgeon, the nurse, but also any person in the room, like a tech person who's maybe monitoring a machine, that everybody in this moment can say something or anything regarding the entire process. So if the surgeon made a error, i.e. like left a piece of equipment in the patient's cavity, that if the tech was the one that observed that mistake at this checkpoint could say, hey, wait a minute, we need to stop. Here's something that's worth noting. And so bringing it back to your concept, which I think is something that we're talking a lot about right now in sports currently, coming from the Google literature and research, which is this term of psychological safety, is not just about having an environment where people can take healthy risks towards failure. It's also about the idea of creating a healthy environment where anyone can communicate to one another an observed issue to be rectified. So bringing it back full circle to the concept of support. Support isn't about having a bunch of yes men around you, but rather having people who can engage in a healthy debate or discussion, come to a forged decision that the leader, head coach or manager owns, and then if everybody in that moment has felt heard, they all then will fully execute. One of the things that I'll also describe to coaches and players in this context is if there is a failure to execute with full commitment, if failure occurs from an outcome standpoint, there will be a question mark of, was it the right play or was it how we executed the play? So if you execute the play with full commitment, we eliminate one of those two options. And so even if you don't agree with the play or the decision, if you execute it fully and we get a bad outcome, it makes it clearer where the error occurred, which makes it easier for the decision makers in the system to eliminate or restructure which play they should put into action next time.
That's absolutely fascinating, and that's taken a deep dive for sure. And my experience, Scott, is that that manager, and I'm going to come back to my experience again of working in soccer here in England, the dynamic between the manager and the coaching staff when it falls down because there lacks certainty, or that certainty is lacking in amongst the group there. Commitment is lacking. Coaches are just going along with what the head coach wants because the perception is that's our boss. Why are we going to risk disagreeing with that person? And I think that it takes a bit of foresight. As you say, Google have done some research on this and referred back to Amy Edmondson's work, I think it was from Harvard University, psychological safety. And it almost feels now that the number one, a big topic of conversation, again over here certainly in Britain, is the leader providing psychological safety, giving his or her fellow coaches the platform to have that difficult conversation that could lead to conflict, but it's having those difficult conversations to be able to, as you said, turn up the volume of commitment.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing about working in the world of sports, especially professional sports, and the way that I try to describe it, like if I'm at a cocktail party, is, it's the stock market. What's interesting is the stock market is not based off of how well companies do. It's really based off of how well we perceive companies will do. So you have this human behavior reactionary element to things that makes the stock market unpredictable. Like if we wanted to create an algorithm, the stock market's really where you'd want to do that because you'd make billions. And the reason why no one's been able to really do it yet is because that's just how complicated human beings are. So I try to, and this is just me personally, with no disrespect to anyone else, but I try to avoid the fads, the fashions, and the buzzwords that come, because what I notice is how much the pendulum will swing because we are on a shot clock, right? Because there is a game every Sunday and there is a sense of urgency. So we'll go, oh, that's the thing. Oh, wait, psychological safety, that's what we got to do. And there are amazing pieces of really empirically validated practices from mindfulness and from psychological safety. Those are nuggets. But are they universal truths? They probably are not. And just because I don't know if universal truths actually exist, going back to the fluctuation of our world, i.e. stock market metaphor. So, going back to like what makes a great coach, or how is it that a team can go from worst to first, or, why did this team, probably the one answer that I think is most truthful that no one would really want to hear, luck. I think there's a lot of luck. And I think luck comes in many different shapes and sizes, because luck is about having the right group of people in the right space at the right time with someone who's got a catalyst of an idea that all of a sudden gets the whole system moving. Luck can come from, a sixth round quarterback who got thrust into a starting role unexpectedly. Luck can come from like one of the NBA teams that I work with. I asked them how they got this all-world player, like one of the best players in the league, and I'm keeping it vague just to protect the story and protect the people in the story. As I said, how did you know? Because it was like they plucked this person out of nowhere, and they said, look, we know we needed a person in that position. There was 3 people in the draft this year that we took them. There was 3 people at that position, and we knew we were going to take one of those 3, and the other 2 were taken before it was our turn to pick. And I said, that's how you ended up with this all-world player? And they said, yep. And I've shared that with a few other GMs that I've worked with. And they said, Scott, you'd be surprised at how often that happens. So I know it's not sexy to say, hey, it's luck. And I guess you can make the counter argument that even in the World Series of Poker, luck isn't, but it seems like the same 5 guys or 5 people are at the final table every time I turn on ESPN or Fox Sports. So I think we, something that I often fold into a conversation is a quote from Louis Pasteur that says, "Chance favors the prepared mind," and I like it because I think it talks about preparation increases the window of opportunity, right? Like chance favors the prepared mind, but it doesn't guarantee victory. So I don't know, maybe that's just me rambling for a little bit, but that's sort of how I tend to think about things.
No, I think, and as you were saying at the end there, it's almost that quote, luck is where preparation and opportunity meet. But I agree with you, and just going back to your initial comments, psychological safety, these buzzwords, I do agree. I think some come along that feel, whether it's theoretically stronger or even feel stronger from an applied perspective, like you feel that you can get more traction with these ideas. I think there is something in that, and picking up on your luck notion, you can, again, coming back to English soccer, a striker might toe poke in an innocuous opportunity and score, having not scored in 5 or 6 games. It's a bit of luck, and then suddenly they go off on a run. I think sometimes players in team invasion sports, sometimes they make it to the big time just because they had a random opportunity because somebody got injured ahead of them. They took their opportunity. Yes, they took their opportunity, but they got that luck in the first place. Luck is very much a part of it, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's like, how do you even define luck? Is luck opportunity, or is it circumstance? Yeah. Is it situational? And it's, again, if we could figure all this stuff out, I think it would actually be the death of sport, because part of what makes sport, to me, sport is the original reality television, right? Like, it's unscripted. We just don't know what's going to happen, and that's what's so exciting about it all. So if we're on this quest to try to solve this thing, it's almost a dog chasing cars. Like, if we actually caught the car, I don't think we would know what to do. Like, we would all sit here and go, well, team A is always going to beat team B, so what's the point of even playing the contest or playing the match? And so I think part of, maybe this is the 7th thing, right? We got 6 things. Maybe here's the 7th thing, is sort of being comfortable with the instability of it all and the uncertainty of it all. Because yes, we all want to win, but at the end of whatever season for whatever sport, there's really only one team that, out of all of them, that's accomplished it. And if we try to replicate that recipe, it's more likely than not going to work. I mean, it's more likely than not going to work. I don't know how to say that better. There's a better chance that it won't succeed to replicate what was done, because what worked really only worked for that team at that time and with those circumstances.
Well, what I can say, and I don't know if it was based on luck, is at the end of a 45-minute podcast, and we had not met before, we've obviously decided we're going to write a book together. We've obviously decided that we have 7 chapters, 7 key concepts that's going to save the coaching world, and everyone's going to live happily ever after.
Well, I like to quote John C. Reilly and Will Ferrell from the movie Step Brothers, where he goes, "Did we just become best friends?" Yep. So this has been a really pleasurable conversation. I'm glad that we had this time together.
Look, thank you so much, Scott. And before you have to dart off, how can people get in contact if that's at all possible?
Sure. Probably the best way is just through email. My email address is Goldman, my last name, Goldman, @athleticintel.com.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Scott. Thanks for taking the time to come on the Sports Psych Show.
Oh, no, this has been a real pleasure. I really enjoyed having a conversation with you.
Thanks so much, Scott. Well, everyone, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, thinks. So if you do have any ideas, please do get in touch via Twitter or Facebook, or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think. I'm really looking forward to next week's episode, and I hope that you can join me. Bye for now.